And I will hand over then to, I think, the first lead, which I think is Steve Haley. Please tell me Steve's in the room. Ah, yes,
I am
there
in
he
the
is.
room. Thanks, Paul. And happy birthday. Didn't know that.
Thank you.
All right. So the first thing we're going to talk about today, which we hope kind of guides the conversation about cross-border. Not everyone in the room, including myself, is a Paul or a Michael or a Julie or someone else who knows about cross-border. To me, cross-border has always been so complicated that I get lost in the first 2 minutes of a conversation because it goes from one concept to another concept to another concept. And so today what we're going to try to do is show how we're breaking that down into smaller chunks so that people like me can follow this work that we're doing and we can stay focused because it's just too big. And one of the things that, before I jump into that, a few very intelligent people have, after our POC discussions the other day, said, well, yeah, but the way you're designing POCs for domestic systems might not necessarily apply when we're talking about multi-country. Exactly. I held my tongue because that's what we're going to talk about today. It's a very different way of doing POCs when we're talking about cross-border. And so today we're going to talk about the cross-border POC strategy and how we make sure that we're focused in doing POCs for cross-border. Why do we care about this so much right now? At the last convening, if anyone missed it, we had the folks from BIS talking about Nexus, which we're incredibly excited about. Nexus is a project to connect instant payment systems. So within Mojaloop, we firmly believe that, obviously we're here because we believe that instant payment systems are the future, and every country is going to eventually have one or two or three of them, and they should all be interconnected. And that is the way we think that the most cost-effective cross-border remittances and payments are going to happen, is by interconnecting in a multilateral way domestic instant payment systems. But that's actually, some of the high-level debates about what that looks like in the future are happening now. And so it's incredibly important that this community focused on inclusivity of instant payment systems is a very loud part of that conversation, because otherwise it's going to go the direction of an exclusively bank-centric role. Like Paul was just talking about, the non-banks, the mobile money, the fintechs, the community banks, the microfinance, all need to be a part of that conversation about the global interconnectivity of instant payment systems. And I hate to put this pressure on you, but you all are the only voice that they have. We've been in these meetings, everybody else is the voice of the banks. We are the voice of all those other institutions. So how do we get more focused on how we're gonna solve that problem? I talked about the POC strategy. What we're gonna talk, can we go to the next slide? Oh, I have it, sorry. All right, cross-border strategy. What we're gonna talk about is thought pieces in the four areas that we've decided to focus on first. And the strategy for that, as this thing, Jane, didn't you fix this yesterday? Anyone? I know. There we go. All right. So the strategy of how we want to do this, there's a lot of POCs happening. You're going to hear about an amazing POC that that FitsterWorks did with MAS and Infotix for cross-border in Asia. We're going to hear, I think, later on from the People's Clearinghouse and what they're getting ready to do on a POC for cross-border from the US to Mexico. There are a number of other cross-border POCs that we're involved in. What we want to make sure that we do is when those POCs are being designed, we design to make sure that we learn the right things. Like if there's a lot of unknowns out there, we want to make sure that at the end of the POC, we've said, okay, we learned what we wanted to learn. And the first part of that is defining what we need to learn. Defining what are the hypotheses and what are the questions that we still have, so that when there's a POC, we can ask the people implementing that POC to test these unknown hypotheses. And so the first step of that is defining the hypotheses, and that's what we're going to talk about today. The strategy we're going with is we've broken it down to 4 streams, substreams of the work stream. We haven't have a name yet, so that we can very clearly define the hypotheses within those substreams and present those to folks like the People's Clearinghouse and say, please test this to see if we're in the right direction, and that can help guide us in the direction of actually taking this to the BIS, to the World Bank, to the people who are designing this global system. So these are the 4 areas that we're focused on. These 3 presenters are going to talk about with their current thinking, the hypotheses that they have around addressing messaging, settlement, and compliance. Again, we all know these things are interconnected, but we have to separate them out if we're going to actually make progress. And they each know that they have 7 minutes. And if any of you know most of these people, that's going to be very difficult for us to keep them to 7 minutes. We're going to do our best. So we're going to kick off. So again, the purpose here is they're going to present their current thinking, their hypotheses, why they think that their substream is incredibly important for making cross-border instant payment systems a reality. Anyone who's interested in these sub-work streams, it's only the 4 of them. We need more assistance, so please figure out which ones of these you'd like to join to help them. So with that, on addressing, Arunjay, are you there?
Yeah, thanks, Steve.
All right, go ahead. You got your 7 minutes to give your pitch.
And are you driving the slides?
I'm trying to drive the slides.
Great. Okay. Yeah, we can move to the next one. So I start with this question: why can't we send money the same way as we send an email? You know, when we send emails, all we need is an email address. You know, so in your case, Steve, if I'm emailing you, I don't need to know your email service provider, your internet service provider, you know, the email service, whether you're using Outlook or Gmail, or, you know, the client that you're using to receive the email on your computer, and whether it's on a mobile phone or a desktop, I just send you an email. But when it comes to sending money, especially cross borders, because domestically it's quite similar to an email, but cross border, you need the equivalent information of all of those things. And, you know, essentially it's a page-long piece of information, the pieces of information that you need to collect and put together. And this is quite cumbersome and has a lot of friction. Next slide, please. So imagine if each email you sent had a different pricing structure to it, depending on who you were writing to, you know, and that the costs go higher the poorer your recipient is. And quite frankly, that's another aspect of cross-border payments, where the pricing differential is significant and something that we need to consider. Next slide. So our vision is that you can send money to anyone, anywhere, just like you can call, message, or email. And now this is not something that, you know, doesn't have precedent. In all of mobile money, you know, a mobile number is a proxy. It is used to address a payment. So if you want to send money to someone, you know, using mobile money, all you need is their mobile number. Similarly, if you want to send money to someone using UPI in India or Pix in Brazil, all you need is a proxy. There are multiple, so it could be a mobile number, email, tax ID, or QR code in Pix in Brazil, or in India, also the mobile number and QR code, but also they have something called a virtual payment address, which looks just like an email address. So these proxies have proven to be extremely critical in the adoption of digital payments. India had the infrastructure called IMPS, so their real-time payment system, from 2011. But it was only with the advent of UPI in 2016 that digital payments really took off. And even though there were other factors like third-party providers and a few other things. The key, one of the key pieces of the puzzle was the ability to use a proxy. Largely it is the mobile number to address the payment. Next slide. So what if we do nothing? The current industry efforts are, really the first thing last month that I want to talk about is the G20 roadmap for enhancing cross-border payments. So building block 16, which is still part of the roadmap, but has been deprioritized in February 2023, right? So what this means is that from the G20 perspective, they have made a decision to focus on other areas, particularly interlinking and compliance, but not on building proxy registries. So that's one. The second is that the private sector are pursuing disparate efforts, but mostly not interoperable. And the third is that there's even no bank-centric solution on the horizon. So current industry efforts are falling short, and the impact of doing nothing, is that the adoption of digital payments remain a challenge, especially for inclusion. Transferring funds remains cumbersome and difficult, as I explained in the example. And then we know that women are impacted more than men when it comes to doing digital transfers and digital payments, which require kind of a workaround or are more cumbersome. Next slide, please. So what are we doing about it? So last year, UNCDF published an exploratory paper called the Open Regulated Global Payment Internetwork. And the concept is not a new scheme or a new network, but connecting all the existing networks. And the first step to doing that is really being able to address payments across networks. So phase one, we propose the directory of proxy directories, which will connect participating proxy directories and return validation of a given proxy, say a mobile number, and the legal entity identifier of the recipient's payment service provider. And finally, this will work on a zero knowledge proof, which means that no personally identifiable information will be returned, especially across a border, which, as you may know, is problematic. So very soon we'll be releasing a technical paper that goes into the details of this. And later this year, we will be running a pilot with participating proxy directories to test so it's a POC to test the interoperability and what do we do when there's duplicate proxies and things like that. So that's coming on stream later this year. Next slide, please. Great. So these are the papers I talked about. The exploratory paper is published. The technical paper, which focuses on phase one, will be published soon. And you can go through these for more information. Next slide. Yeah. So in summary, our goal is to speed up total interoperability, to allow users to use an easy to remember proxy alias, such as a mobile number or email address. And third is to increase adoption of digital payments by reducing that friction. So thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Ranju. We're not going to have any questions. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I believe I stuck to my 7 minutes though.
You did. I was actually just going to say you did a great job of your 7 minutes. So we'll have some questions at the end for the whole group. We want to go through all 4, but I do want to highlight just saying, remember what I said at the beginning of it's about defining the hypotheses, publishing those hypotheses, and then doing some proof of concept. So we're incredibly excited that for addressing, UNCDF was already leading that, and we're just joining their fight. So we'll be a part of that POC. We invite everyone else to also contribute to us in Mojaloop's involvement in that POC, and we're very excited to move forward with it. So thank you, and next we're going to talk about messaging with Michael Richards.
Thanks very much, Steve. So when I started thinking about this, I thought about the convenings and I wondered really what was missing from them. And it occurred to me that the clicker isn't. Pick it up. There isn't enough philosophers in the convening. So here's some philosophers, and my question is, what unites all these philosophers? Well, they all wrote in German. I was going to say they were German until I remembered that Wittgenstein was Austrian. They're all men, we don't like that, and they're all white. But actually, the thing that unites all these philosophers is that they thought what they were doing was constructing something that was true for all places, for all times, forever. Unfortunately, nobody has yet managed that. So I want to introduce you, hopefully, to another philosopher who I know will immediately be known to you. This gentleman is called Emmanuel Eze. He's a Nigerian philosopher. And what his project is to create a philosophy which is specifically an African philosophy. His argument is that all philosophies, in fact, are based on the societies and the communities in which they are evolved. Now, that doesn't mean they don't have the same responsibilities for rationality, coherence, investigation as all the other philosophies, but they are specific to their community and to their society. So one of the things that I want to talk about now is the difference between philosophies of messaging. So the problem is, broadly speaking, come back. Oh, there we go. So message definition really proceeds from the ground up. Message definitions are defined typically to solve local problems of intercommunication between two known systems. And they expand in response to evolving local needs. So what starts off as a bilateral relationship between two banks or two mobile money systems, they think, oh, maybe this would work for connecting all mobile money systems together. And people say, yeah, but there's kind of slight wrinkles, we have to include that. So we're gradually moving up, generalizing, making things more abstract. But actually, they work from the top down. They make the participants who are using those messages conform to the message structure, which takes on a kind of independent existence. And that means, as always the case, that there are nonconformist adaptations to local needs. It's a law of nature that structure always migrates into data, because individual users always find that the structure is not adequate to the data they need to store, and therefore they use individual fields for things which they were not originally intended for. Guilty as charged, I admit it. We heard about it when the FRMS people, the Actio people were talking and saying, well, actually they thought that two systems that they were dealing with were using the same message. Actually, it turns out that although they were using something that looked like the same message, they were using the fields for different things. So every message structure is meaningful in a specific payment context, which may not immediately be obvious from that structure. And that means that an individual institution typically will need to belong to more than one payment system. Now, that is a problem, because the inclusive approach, like ISO 20022, just displaces the expression of local needs to markets practice definition. It just says, we've got a large bucket of stuff here, and it's up to you to decide which things you want to pick out of the bucket and use yourself. Adopting the local approach, which is essentially what Nexus has done, means that financial institutions need to belong to different payment systems and use different messages depending on the kinds of connection they're trying to make. What if we do nothing? Well, the market will continue to converge on message content which is determined by the ability of individual account holding institutions, banks or mobile money systems, or village savings and loan associations or credit unions to connect to multiple interop systems using different message types. And that eventually means that the ability to participate in payment systems will be defined by the economic power of the institutions themselves. Large banks, large mobile money systems will have the resources to connect to multiple payment systems, whereas the small banks, the tiny credit unions, the village savings and loan associations, they don't have those resources. It's as much as they can do to connect to one payment system. And therefore, the spread of payment systems will be restricted by people's ability to buy a seat at the table. Now, what's missing here? It's a secret. The question of interconnecting between systems rather than interconnecting between institutions. And that can extend interconnection to institutions of any type and size. By allowing intermediate interoperation systems to bear some of the interconnection burden. Here we see an interop system in the form of St. Christopher, bearing the Christ child, one of the VSLAs, and doing the work on behalf of the VSLA. That means it can join and doesn't have to pay itself. I can see this is going to be a long day. So what approach are we recommending? We want to think about the interconnection between systems and not between institutions. We want to extend by translation and not by abstraction. You know what we've said already, that gradually, as definitions move up the generality chain, they become more abstract. We want to propose an answer that says, actually, we want systems to remain at the same level they're at now and to intercommunicate via translation. So we can solve the hierarchical specialization problem of abstract systems by making it into a conversion problem. That's the route we're going down at the moment. So what's the problem with connecting schemes? It's non-repudiability. Now, one of the things that we are fundamentally committed to in the Mojolib community is the non-repudiability. That is, the ability, when an institution receives a message, to have some reliable way of verifying that the message was actually sent by the institution that is supposed to have sent it, and that it hasn't been modified in transit. That's a fundamental thing that we need to be able to support. And that's something that becomes complex when you look at how systems connect with each other, when the institutions in the individual systems may not know anything about the other systems that they're connecting. They need to have some general way of doing that. Now, the technique itself is not difficult. Everybody knows how to do it. It's Java Web Signatures or similar. The problem is how to get that information across, and in particular, we've got cross-network providers. Now, we understand them very well. They're one of the, I think, unsung innovations of the Mojolib community. We talk a lot about the switch, we talk a lot about the hub, but actually, Payment Manager, which is a simple adapter pattern, is an extraordinarily powerful thing which we're using in all kinds of different ways to translate, for instance, between Mojoloop systems and the core banking systems of individual institutions. The problem with the cross-network provider is that it destroys end-to-end repudiability because the cross-network provider needs to sign the converted message. And that has to be the converted message because it's the thing that goes forward into the other system. And it's also based on the assumption that the cross-network provider will be the liquidity provider, so everybody says, well, that doesn't matter much. But actually, this is the assumption that Nexus makes, that there will always be a map, a direct map, between the cross-network provider and the liquidity provision, the ability to settle in the system. However, you're going to hear later on this morning about a system where that is not the case, where the cross-network provider is doing something different from managing liquidity. So, what will we need to do to retain end-to-end non-repudiability across schemes? We would need a reliable way for a financial institution to obtain the public key of any other financial institution which was reachable across the network of schemes. We need a way to convert message content across schemes, and you know what I really hate is the way sometimes it just works and you think, oh, great. There we are. Needs to be obviously secured by a standard test suite, which can be executable by any participant. And we need a reliable way to obtain the content of a received message in a standard format, which in the real world is known as a canonicalization service. Also that, of course, needs to be secured by a test suite. Ooh, now this is going to be terrible because there's lots of clicks on this. Yeah, keep going. That says Steve. Wrap up. I'm wrapping up. So that's the area that we want to start looking at in the next PI. Alternative approaches are extremely welcome. We are a broad church, but this is the way we're thinking at the moment. Interconnection between schemes and not between individual institutions, where we use translation rather than abstraction as a way of guaranteeing that schemes can interact with each other. So now I get to learn Steve to work his way through the rest of this slide. Good luck.
Thanks so much, Michael. Let's hear from Michael for bringing us from philosophy to technical. And yes, note for all future presenters, only one click per slide. Oh, you really did leave me with this, didn't you? I did. What's that? No, we got two more, and then we'll have some discussions. So we've heard about addressing, we've heard about messaging, and as Michael mentioned, I mean, those are things that it's so exciting to think I can send an email to anyone. That makes sense to me. That's a problem I want to solve. Like the different messaging problems between banks and non-banks, and that's a problem. It seems very tangible thing I can solve. Now we're going to get into Julie, who probably has the most difficult, probably the biggest cost driver for cross-border, but not the most fun. So we appreciate that Julie is going to make it exciting for us, as exciting as talking about German philosophers. So Julie, welcome, and please tell us where your progress is on settlement.
And what do you mean? Like settlement is fun? Come on, this is the fun part in cross-border payment. Okay, so what is effectively like, I think the problem statement, and I try to go quick because I knew I shouldn't have been after Michael. So, because you always consume all the time. So basically, like if you look at effectively the issue with cross-border payment, I think there is no surprise in what is mentioned in the slide, right? They are too costly, not transparent enough, too slow, and with limited access, right? So we just heard about some reason why the cross-border payment face this issue. But I think like if we look deep down on actually how we can address some of the challenges, particularly on the cost side, we need to find a way to make sure that settlement is done at a lower cost as well for effectively the parties that needs to settle the payments, whether it's a bank, whether it's a mobile money provider, and so on. If you look at effectively why settlement in cross-border payment is expensive, you have several reasons. Reason one is like at the end of the day, you still need to maintain relationship with other banks. So you need to have a network of relationship to be able to settle a cross-border payment. And actually like this remains true when you link to the IIPS system. So for example, Nexus still rely on this to settle their payment. Two, you need to have access to liquidity because often when you do a cross-border payment, you have foreign exchange currency being involved. And what is effectively like access to liquidity? So some of liquidity in the world are actually not easy to get. And this is particularly true in developing countries where no one wants to hold some foreign currency because they're very volatile and it's a risk, right? So effectively, this is also an issue. And what you have often is like when you have two foreign currency involved between, for example, two developing countries, actually in the background, you have often two foreign exchange conversion against the dollar. So the fees that you have add up quite quickly. And finally, like why costs are high, it's because of the settlement risk. So for example, like, let's say I want to initiate a payment to Michael. I'm based in Singapore, is in the UK. So we need to do a conversion between like, Sing dollar and GBP. So what will happen is like my bank will say, hey, I'm selling it's a Singapore dollar, I'm keen to buy some GBP, right? And let's say like this transfer happened directly, like let's say between Michael and I'm running a risk that if I give first my GBP, my Sing dollar to Michael, he may run away and never give me my GBP, right? So this is effectively the settlement risk that is priced by banks. And depending on the currency that is involved in the foreign exchange conversion, this risk can be quite high. And so the settlement risk quite high as well, and the cost of the payment quite high. Next slide, please. So effectively, like, what if we do nothing? I think the first one is we're gonna not be able to achieve the G20 quantitative KPI published, particularly the one around cost, because again, like a fair portion of the cost of a cross-border payment come from the settlement cost. Two, we will probably increase fragmentation, because what will happen is if we want to deliver the G20 quantitative KPI, and again, the one particularly around cost, financial institution will look at what are the corridors that are most profitable, and we'll focus on that, leaving some of the corridor very dry, right? Consequence number three is we probably see an increase usage of the alternative rails, and particularly perhaps the ones that are effectively very much unregulated, or the ones that are leveraging non-sovereign currency. So for example, we could see that crypto rails are being used in the cross-border payment space, but we know that this type of rails today have very little protection for the customer. I think we've seen it all in the news recently. So that's issue number one. And issue number two is actually using this type of rails may increase their weight and their impact on the financial stability overall of the financial system. So I think we need to be also careful about this. I think also Aranjay mentioned this as well for alias resolutions. So settlement has been treated the same way by the FASB. IE is being deprioritized at the moment from the roadmap, except the effort on CBDC. So I think it's even more important for us as a private entity to look at this issue, because like I said, like the industry may not be focused on this anymore. Next slide, please. Thank you. I see the clicker is really much outside, but I'll carry on. So what are effectively like, you know, the approach you listed? So I think the idea is to try to look at various solutions to be able to reduce the cost of settlement. So the first one is like potentially work on a regional CBDC and see how we can effectively, like, you know, use this mechanism to settle payment. The option 2 could be actually like, you know, integrating a settlement layer within Mojaloop and test on again on a regional settlement with potentially a pre-funded scheme, leveraging the existing e-payments rail. And what I call e-payments rail is one usually maintained by central banks. Option 3 could be actually like, you know, trying to accelerate integration with a regional project that include a settlement layer. And option 4 could be actually investigate how Mojaloop can be used as a bridge between omnibus accounts. So omnibus accounts is currently a solution like being looked at in the UK. It's being actually looked at in several jurisdictions, and the idea is like leverage central bank money to settle 24/7. But today, like if you look at this on a cross-border basis, there is no bridge between omnibus accounts. So the idea would be to potentially look at this. The hypothesis we want to prove is effectively that if we have fewer intermediaries involved in the settlement of the transaction, the cost and the risk are reduced. And also like what we want to try to do is to limit the involvement of settlement banks, because we know that often like smaller financial institution needs to onboard with commercial banks, and not everyone is accepted, it's costly for them and so on. So we want to limit the interaction with the commercial banks as much as possible. That's it from my side.
All right, thanks so much, Julie. And let's see if we can. All right, so thank you. And before we move on to kind of a summary at the end, I'm going to pass it back to Paul, who is going to talk about his area, which is compliance. We'll save the best for last. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Steve. Compliance is probably one of the key enablers to cross-border transactions. If you don't comply with the regulations, then you are shut down in pretty short order. Technically, speaking very broad brush here, cross-border transactions are pretty easy. In the course of my career, I've seen a number of people pop up and say, hey, we can do cross-border. We just need to interconnect these particular 2 pipes here, and it'll all work. And then they get shut down in very short order, often within a day, when the lawyers get involved and point out the risks. So you cannot ignore compliance. To me, compliance, yeah, okay, the other 3 areas are difficult as well, but if you don't get compliance wrong, then if you don't get compliance right, then the directors of your company end up in jail in fairly short order. It's astonishing we've got this far in discussion of cross-border without mentioning FATF, the Financial Action Task Force. It's an international organization, for those of you who haven't come across it, which tries to provide a framework for monitoring compliance in cross-border transactions. People often think that FATF relates to domestic transactions. It doesn't. A country and its regulators and its financial sector can completely ignore FATF if they don't want to ever conduct transactions outside their own borders. However, if you do want to engage in a cross-border transaction, then you need to be FATF compliant. Note that FATF don't make rules. They make recommendations. They recommend to regulators how they should define the national regulations. The majority, or probably about half of the FATF recommendations, actually tell the regulator how they should operate. They're not directed to financial institutions at all. The remainder of the recommendations tell financial sector actors how they should meet the other recommendations, those which relate to the regulator. They're focused on anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism, and in recent years they've also added a third acronym, CPF, which is proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. So it's all about controlling this criminal and terrorist activity in cross-border transactions. There's a lot of derived recommendations around CDD, customer due diligence, which is KYC on steroids, and transaction monitoring. Historically, banks have overreacted to FATF, and essentially, in some cases, actually engaging in what's known as de-risking. So they actually closed down international transactions along corridors which are seen as risky. The FATF rode back on that, tried to say to the banks, "Hey guys, we didn't mean that. Honest, you're overreacting," but it was too late. And in any case, there were a lot of multi-billion, and that's a billion with a B, fines which were levied against some of the large international banks, which just confirmed the bank's suspicions that essentially they shouldn't engage in these more risky corridors. What I was going to say, FATF, when you actually talk to them, when you actually engage with them, it makes a lot of sense. There's not a lot there that you could really argue with. It's just, how do you meet those recommendations, which is the real problem. Maybe you could move to the next slide, Steve. We're seeing a lot of activity at the moment, trying to ease international transactions, trying to ease the compliance burden. But if you actually dive into them, they're largely made by institutions in the developed, the industrialized world, which are very focused on banks. They follow the model that trust is actually between regulators. So the regulators say that they carry out due diligence on the national financial institutions, and FATF, through a series of the world of FATF is a world of acronyms. We have bodies called the FSRBs, which act on a regional basis as a collaboration between regulators to do mutual evaluations. So they each check each other's regulations and the way that they are enacted to check that they are compliant. So the trust actually acts between regulators. That's the fundamental element. And they vouch for their regulated entities because they have supervised them according to the FATF recommendations. So it actually only works down to banks. Mobile wallets, MFIs, collectively known as the NBFIs, the non-bank financial institutions, they're all on the outside. Sometimes they're supported, but it's all at a price. Next slide. And Steve, I'm seeing the messages to hurry up. Thank you. Next slide. Yeah. Okay. So we have to, if we're going to address this, we have to develop a trust framework building on the FATF recommendations that extends down to the NBFIs. From a technical transactional perspective, we can already manage that within Mojaloop, but it needs to be extended. We need to be looking at carrying evidence of CDD compliance with or derived from the transaction in some way, so that a connected institution can verify that the other institution on the other side of the world is doing its due diligence properly. And there has to be evidence that the NBFI is itself compliant. And we have to be able to prove that. So we have to prove that a mobile wallet in Myanmar is carrying out the due diligence correctly according to the national regulation. And actually, maybe not a great example in Myanmar, to ensure that they are meeting the standards set out by FATF. It goes way beyond mere CDD compliance. You have to develop an understanding of what compliance means in the NBFI community and how they have to develop their processes internally to demonstrate CDD compliance and all the rest that goes with that. And we need to support them in that. The financial community needs to provide them with the tools to demonstrate they comply. And we as a community here have to make sure that Mojaloop integration includes some element of demonstrating that compliance. And we have to work with the regulatory authorities to validate this approach. We have to talk with the supranational entities, BIS, even FATF, if we can get close enough, in order to validate this approach, because everything that's being done so far is great for international transactions between banks, but it doesn't reach down to the NBFIs, and we need to bring their voice to the table. And with that, I'll end there. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everybody. I do want to open up for a few questions, but I want to make a couple of notes first. We are going to have a break a little bit late, and I've unilaterally decided that, but Michael, who's going to be talking about some messaging with Interledger and ISO later on, has said he'll go faster, whether we believe him or not. But so we'll make up that time later on, but this is a great conversation I wanted to continue. So that's one. The other is that the five of us actually get together every week for about half an hour, and I would say probably all of us would agree it's probably the highlight half hour of our week. It's an exciting time where we philosophize and talk about, they philosophize, I listen, about cross-border and how all these pieces fit together. But it's really given us a great structure to be able to divide it up into those four leading substreams. So now that we've been doing that for a couple of months to get us to this point, we do want to open it up. And so more people are going to be invited. So please reach out to us if you want to be a part of this work stream. But we are very active as a group. We did it very small on purpose so that we could be very active, but we really want more people to start joining within this structure that we've defined, especially because, I mean, as we've talked quite a bit, Paul doesn't need to be leading a sub-work stream. He's leading the entire product strategy. So particularly on compliance, and I'm looking at the Actio guys, anybody else who wants to work on compliance, we need to start pulling Paul out of work streams. Sorry, Paul. And I'm not the greatest facilitator. It's not necessarily what I do a great job at. So also the role that I've been playing of convening these four experts, we also want somebody to kind of play that role as well. So somebody else who's good at project management, but also knows quite a bit about cross-border. We really want you to come into this work stream as well. So that's my quick call to join our very exciting club working on this. And with that, I think there was a couple of questions. So we are going to take one question. But if you have more questions, please join our little group.
Thanks, Tim. I'll try to be very brief, but there were four main issues, which probably, if you allow me, to more than one question, or more of a comment. Let me pick on the last one, which is the aspect of compliance. I think you've rightly pointed out about FATF. The FATF goes much, much beyond what you've just mentioned. I'm from Mauritius. We got on the FATF grey list, which immediately got us into the blacklist of the EU, and that the whole system collapsed for over a year. So I think it's not a simple issue. But linked to that, maybe you might also wish to look at FATF regional setups. In our region, it's the ASAMLAG. ASAMLAG is more appropriate for us to be able to. So I think this is something fundamental when we talk about compliance. If we are not fully compliant, we've got a huge issue. And that is one of the things that central banks will look at. Any payment system you put up, we will need to see whether it is compliant or it's not compliant. We had a presentation on fraud, I think, yesterday morning. That is something that Mojaloop needs to look into. But in the fraud module, the AML CFT must be built into it. Otherwise, it doesn't serve any purpose. Fraud and AML CFT there are two different kettle of fish. I don't think you can mix them. I think that was my first issue. The second one was in terms of messaging. I think the problem with different type of messaging systems does create a problem. What we've done us at COMESA, which is our payment system, COMESA Clearinghouse Regional Payment Settlement System, we have aligned on the SWIFT network. So our system is totally SWIFT-based. MT 103, MT 202, and the whole, right? And now we are moving into 200, ISO 222. So I think that could be one standard. Otherwise, you have a problem to make payments. So the thing is probably if Mojaloop decides that you're going to go for one type of messaging system, then there's always room for negotiation with SWIFT so that this cost can be brought drastically down. My biggest issue with SWIFT was that, when you do a cross-border payment, there's a minimum charge that goes $30, $40 in our region to do that. And that's very, very high. So I told SWIFT, you are very expensive, that's why people don't want to use you. He says, no, nothing to do with us. If you look at our cost per message, it's next to nothing. But it's the banks that built that one, and for whatever reasons. So to address that, what we've done in our system is that our system has got a settlement bank. Our system is a central bank-based system owned and managed by central banks. So one of our central banks is the settlement bank, which is, in our case, the Bank of Mauritius. So all our transactions go, but we do only transact in convertible currency, which now addresses the issue of exchange rates. So which means when you hit our system, you do it either in US dollar or in euros. So the risk is, because our central bank must make it very clear, we are a central bank, we are not in the business of taking commercial risk. That you shift it back to where it's been generated and let them address it. So I think these are one or two issues, and then during the conversation, maybe if I can come back again. Thank you.
Thanks, and Simeon, unfortunately, one of our board members is going to talk. But thank you, I just want to say thank you. Please join our group. These are amazing questions that we struggle with every week.
I'm very glad you brought up the questions on the FATF compliance. I will say that we've experienced it concretely at the Gates Foundation and the work that we've done when we looked at the process of what was politely called de-risking, where you have a marginal compliance question that arises in one market and every other market says, you're not compliant, I can't talk to you. And so they simply remove the institutions. The problem is, it's not the institution's fault. It's the regulations are not harmonized between those regions, as you just heard from the gentleman at the front. So we have to look at it systematically, I think. And briefly on the messaging standards, I think that's an important point. I do like what I saw from Michael, the notion that we might have a canonical form that we'd use to map between, that apparently is emerging as the ISO standard that everyone agrees to. This is the place where you go back to SWIFT and you say, you are embracing this, and of course SWIFT runs the ISO community work in this process, so it would be a bit of a cognitive disconnect for them to say, no, you have to use MT messaging when they're supporting the international standard that should become canonical. But it's just, I want to underscore the point that if we don't have support for instant payment systems and non-bank financial institutions in the global messaging standard, then we will fail. Because the standard will pervade, it will continue to lock down the bank-only and bank-led systems, and the rest of us will be left to work through correspondent, which is the thing that's causing the cost to be so erratic. So I definitely want to see the work that Michael has teed up to that. One thing that you guys could be helpful with, there was no link to the UNCDF article. It's not hard to find on Google, but it would be even easier if there were actually a link to the paper. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Miller. And yes, if anything that these two gentlemen just said was exciting to you, please do pay attention to what Michael's going to talk about with Interledger and ISO later on today. I do want to make a point. My point on the FATF thing is, in some of our conversations with some of these big multilateral bank-led institutions, when we bring that up, it's like, well, yeah, that's the gray list countries. Like it really is just forget about them. Whereas I think if we were to look in around in this country or in this room, I'm guessing that we could count a whole bunch of people who are from or have lived in countries that have been on a gray list at some point in your lifetime. This is not just an abstract thing that we can forget about. This is critical to how we make sure that we bring financial inclusion. We cannot ignore the gray list problem. So thank you both for bringing that up. And I
Can
know
I just
Simeon's
comment
gonna-
on that briefly? Yeah.
Okay, last comment to Paul, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, the grey list problem is really important. I cut my teeth on this and working in Somalia, trying to get international transactions into Somalia, and the de-risking problem that arose there was completely crippling the economy. So developing the risk, we developed a risk framework there which should have solved the problem, but ultimately it was killed by the lack of risk appetite, complete lack of risk appetite from banks, particularly in the US, who are worried about this multi-million-dollar fine issue. So until we can get assurance that banks that in some point in their operations do settle in dollars will not end up in court with a multi-billion-dollar fine because of some element of operational non-compliance, then we're not going to make progress on this.
Okay, and with that, clearly everyone wants to keep talking about this. Please join our little group and talk about it every week with us. We love it.
Thanks so much, Paul and Steve.